Our appetite for animal foods, for meat and dairy, might be the most dangerous force on planet Earth today. Hungry for the flesh and fat of our fellow creatures, we are eating the world to oblivion. Livestock farming on a global scale is ecologically expensive. It consumes land, devours forests, poisons rivers, and fuels the climate crisis. And we are hungry. We demand more. Such has been the shift in the balance of life that the global population of farmed animals has tripled in the past half-century, while wild animal populations have declined by 2/3, and these trends are squarely related. Measured by biomass, humans and our livestock now represent 96% of the mammals on this planet. 96%. Just 4% are wild. And though we say we care about animal welfare, the food on our plate often tells a different story. The vast majority of animals farmed globally are reared on factory farms. That includes 95% of the chickens we eat here in the UK, while only 3% of British pigs will spend their whole life outdoors. Most are confined in these dim, miserable sheds. But here's the thing. This is what I want to tell you. It's not that we don't care. It's not that we're cruel or callous or indifferent. Quite the opposite. The issue is that we do care. We're acutely sensitive to the harm that we cause. So sensitive that we have, over successive generations, constructed these coping mechanisms, these cognitive and cultural distancing mechanisms, through which we detach from reality, dissociate from our dietary choices. I want to talk about those mechanisms. I want to explain why it is our empathy that makes our appetite so dangerous. If we're to have any hope of a more sustainable or equitable future, we need to get to grips with the complex psychology of meat. We need to understand that we're caught in the meat paradox. But let's begin at the beginning. We've been eating animals for a long time. The earliest evidence comes from Ethiopia, 3.4 million years ago. Cut marks on animal bones which show signs of butchery. By 2.5 million years ago, we were regularly picking at carcasses, scavenging from skeletons, eating animals ranging in size from hedgehogs to elephants. By the time the first early humans evolved, our ancestors, we were squarely omnivorous. Meat and fat formed an important part of our diets. And this is written throughout our body, this omnivory. It's in the size of our brain and the shape of our jaws, the wiring of our metabolism, and the functioning of our digestive system. We began as scavengers, and then we learned to hunt. We became top-level predators. And for most of this long history, we were much like any other animal. We were like the lion or the fox or the bear. We ate the foods that were available to us, plant or animal, and if they were nourishing, then they were good. But something changed. At some point in this long history, something changed. Eating animals became emotionally complicated, for we began to empathize with our prey. Not long ago, I spent the day in what we euphemistically call a meat processing plant, a metal shed where we take pigs and cows and sheep to be killed. It wasn't an easy place. I didn't enjoy my time there. It was intense. And I was rather more involved than I would have liked. My fingers were bloodied. I can still recall the weight of the gun in my hand. Killing animals for food is distressing. It's disturbing. You might question this. You might look at me and think, well, this guy's just a urban snowflake millennial. He's all squeamish and sentimental. And there might be some truth in that. But it's not the whole truth. For in every society, in every non-industrial society that we know of, the act of killing is constrained within a carefully constructed ritual and narrative framework. In early agricultural societies, it was the job of the priest. Temples were open-air butcher shops. The only meat that could be consumed had to come from an animal that had first been sacrificed to the gods. The meat was a byproduct of the sacrifice. In many indigenous societies, we find the hunt enveloped in the web of ritual. It must be conducted in the right manner. The body must be treated correctly, the meat prepared correctly, and if all is well, the animal's soul will be reborn in new flesh. And these ritual and narrative frameworks are designed to help us make sense of the fact that it's distressing that we kill. But we lack such a narrative framework in our society, in the UK, in Europe and North America. We don't really know what to make of the fact that we kill to eat. So for the most part, we just look away. We avert our gaze. We simply pretend it isn't happening. Now, we're kind of unusual in that sense. There's not many societies that do this. And in fact, most societies, it's not really an option. Follow me briefly to northern Siberia, the upper Kolyma River, home of the Yukagir, who are one of the oldest indigenous peoples in Northeast Asia. The Yukagir are hunters and trappers, and the way that they hunt tells us something very important about the psychology of meat and the predicament that we are in. So the Yukagir hunter searches for reindeer or elk in the forest, and in order to find his prey, he must become like the animal he seeks. Through a process of dehumanization, he seeks to shed his human identity. He begins by wiping his body with the bark and leaves of a birch tree, knowing that the elk that he seeks is pleased by the aroma. He sheds his language. No words will be used. If any sounds are made, it'll typically be a sound impersonating the animal he hopes to attract. He's dressed in furs. His skis are wrapped in skins to replicate the sound of the animal moving over snow. And now, thinking like an elk, dressed like an elk, he goes into the forest to search for elk. He searches between the trees, looking for snared branches and nibbled leaves. And when he finds his prey, his performance grows more elaborate. He begins to sway from side to side, waddling in an elk-like manner. He approaches, smelling like a tree, talking like an elk, dressed like an elk, and moving like the animal's kin. And the elk is curious. The elk doesn't flee, but instead starts to approach, at which point the hunter raises his gun and shoots. Now, the details of this hunting strategy are unique to the Yukagir, but anthropologists have realized that similar strategies involving perspective-taking, imitation, and a form of empathy are employed across the world, from the Arctic to the Amazon, across to the Kalahari and beyond. They are distinctively human and profoundly old as well. It's not easy to hunt a mammal in the wild. These creatures are often faster than us, stronger than us, keen senses. In the absence of complex technology, our ability to procure our prey, to get our hands on their meat, has long been reliant on this capacity for perspective-taking, for imitation, deception. But those very cognitive capacities which make us successful hunters also pose a challenge, for they involve a form of empathy. Spend long enough thinking like an elk, talking like an elk, moving like an elk, it becomes difficult to deny that the elk is conscious and sentient. The elk is obviously a person of sorts, an elk person, an animal person, not quite the same as a human person, but a person nonetheless. And the Yukagir talk about this. They enjoy their meat, they need it to survive, but they're also disturbed by the fact that their mode of subsistence relies on killing other persons. And one hunter says, whenever I kill another animal, it feels a bit like killing another human. And what is it to kill another person but to commit a murder? You might be familiar with this phrase, meat is murder. It probably conjures images of animal rights activists dressed in black with balaclavas. But the perception might be far more universal, more cross-cultural, and deep-rooted in human evolution. The perception that meat involves an act akin to murder is something that many societies have had to grapple with. Now, the narratives that surround meat, that surround animal consumption, are a response to this, a way of helping us make sense of the fact that we kill to eat. The Yukagir tell a story of negotiation and barter. Before he goes into the forest, the hunter must strike a deal with this cosmic being called Kozian, the master of animals, the guardian of all the creatures who live between the trees. He must make offerings in dream and dance. And if the negotiation is successful, then a portion of those animals are released to be hunted. But they must be hunted in the right way. There are conditions, and the strictest condition concerns necessity. The hunter must genuinely need to eat meat, and so he'll wait until he's hungry, his family is hungry, before going into the forest. And failure to meet this condition or to deliver the right rituals will result in reparation, disease, death. Now, this narrative places a powerful curb on the community's consumption. It's emotionally binding. morally compelling. And this is what we lack. We're obviously not going to tell the same story as the Yukagear, but we don't really have a narrative that helps us make sense of the fact that we kill to eat. For the most part, we simply look away. We avert our gaze. Slaughterhouses are typically located out of town, out of sight and out of mind, and that's deliberate. This is low-paid work. We give it to migrants. We relegate it to the margins. Now, the food industry is complicit in this. They don't want us to be confronted with the reality of food production. And in fact, they deliberately try to deceive us in various ways. Retailers place fake farm labels on their meat products, images which imply that the animals have been reared in green fields where they're frolicking and happy, masking the industrial nature of production. And we engage in more subtle forms of detachment and dissociation. Most of us can readily eat a bacon sandwich or a chicken wrap or a hamburger without once thinking of the animal who provided it. We don't like to think about their life. We don't like to think about their death. And we categorize animals. And we say these are food and these are not food. And we channel our empathy, our concern towards our chosen subset, our pets, our cats and dogs, while withdrawing it from farmed animals. We lower our estimation of their mind and sentience and moral value. We also take comfort in repetition, and this is the really important point that psychologists have just realized in the past 10 years. When confronted with the reality of our dietary choices, the consequences, the harm that we cause, we often respond not by eating less meat or better meat, but by eating more. We take comfort in the very repetition and regularity of that action. We entrench ourselves in an established pattern of behavior. We take comfort as well in the fact that everyone around us is doing the same thing. Our responsibility is dissolved into the crowd. And I'm telling you all this not to make you feel bad or guilty. That's really not my intention. This thing is bigger than any one of us, this edifice of dissociation and detachment which has been built around us over many generations. What's important is that we begin to awaken to it, because it's dangerous. High demand for meat, for animal foods, is keeping us locked into this industrial mode of production, tied into the factory farming system. And factory farming is symbiotic with fossil fuel use. Factory farms also provide breeding grounds for novel pathogens. The next pandemic is already brewing on a pig or a chicken farm. Human and planetary health cannot withhold, cannot sustain what is coming to them if our dietary trajectory extends into the future. So we need to change. And there's lots of stuff we need to do to change. But the very first thing, I think, is to start to look at ourselves slightly differently. Start to think about ourselves slightly differently. And understand that the deep past is still alive within us. It's a very modern world we live in, but we are, in some respects, still creatures of the Paleolithic. And the deep past is still alive within you. The many generations that your ancestors lived among animals, studying them, gazing at them, they're still written within you. Our detachment from that history is very peculiar. The many generations that we played as animals, danced as animals, that we took their cries and calls onto our tongue, that's still written within us. This deep-rooted physical connection that was expressed in the hunt, where we began to blur the boundary between species, become other than we are. And this has left us with this capacity for empathy, which is unevenly expressed, but is still always there, and which comes alive when we're confronted with an animal in the moment of their death. So this is what I want you to understand. We are the most peculiar of creatures, an evolutionary oddity, a predator inclined to empathize with its prey, a flesh-hungry primate disturbed by its own mode of subsistence. Our appetite for animal foods might be the most dangerous force on planet Earth today. But it's not that we don't care. The issue is that we do. Through our empathy, we are caught in the meat paradox.